Ryan Correll gave the best man speech at my wedding, and 3 years later I found out he'd been rehearsing a different kind of intimacy with my wife the entire time he was writing it. My name is James Halloway. I'm 33, I teach American history to sophomores at a public high school in Tulsa, and until 11 months ago I believed the two steadiest relationships in my life were my marriage and my friendship with the man who'd known me since we were 9 years old, sharing a treehouse and a mutual distrust of authority. I was wrong about one of them so completely that it eventually poisoned my certainty about the other. I found out the way most people find out things they should have seen coming, sideways, by accident, on an ordinary Tuesday that had no business becoming the day my life split into two unequal halves. But that's not where this story actually starts. It starts 3 years earlier, at an engagement dinner that half my future in-laws didn't bother to attend, and it took me 3 more years to understand why. Claire and I got engaged on a Saturday in October, in a state park outside the city, under a stand of blackjack oaks that were exactly the wrong shade of orange for the moment to look as cinematic as I'd hoped. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I remember thinking, in that specific way you only think about things afterward, that it was the happiest I'd ever be, and not knowing that the sentence hadn't fully ended yet, that somewhere behind us, a different conversation about our engagement was already happening without me. We planned a dinner the following week, nothing extravagant, just close family at a steakhouse downtown to celebrate. Claire's parents, Donna and Gary Bennett, canceled the morning of. A work conflict, Donna said on the phone, apologetic in a way that didn't quite match her voice. Claire's older sister came without them, made excuses on their behalf that even I, 29 years old and thoroughly unsuspicious by nature, could tell were borrowed rather than owned. I let it go. That's the first thing you should understand about me, because it explains everything that follows. I have spent my whole life extending people the benefit of the doubt so generously that I sometimes forgot doubt was an option at all. My mother used to say I'd trust a stranger with my car keys if he smiled at me the right way. I always took that as a compliment. I don't anymore. Claire cried a little that night, after her sister left, sitting on the edge of our bed with her knees pulled up. When I asked what was wrong, she said her parents were old-fashioned, that they'd wanted her to marry someone from church, someone whose family they'd known longer than 3 years. I believed her. It was a believable explanation, delivered by someone I loved, about people I barely knew yet. I held her until she stopped crying and told myself the wedding would fix it, that once we were actually married, the Bennetts would come around, the way families in movies always seem to. They came to the wedding. Donna cried during the vows, the ordinary kind of crying mothers do. Gary shook my hand afterward and told me to take care of his daughter, the way fathers are supposed to. I filed the engagement dinner away as an odd blip in an otherwise normal courtship, the kind of small unresolved mystery every marriage probably carries somewhere in its foundation. I didn't know, standing in that reception hall in my rented tux, that the mystery wasn't resolved. It had just gone quiet, the way a fault line goes quiet between earthquakes. Ryan Correll stood beside me at that wedding in a suit he bought specifically for the occasion, because he told me, half joking, that a best man owed the groom that much respect. He gave a speech that made half the room laugh and the other half cry, told a story about us building a treehouse at 9 years old and falling out of it together at 11, breaking his arm and my collarbone on the same Saturday. Everyone loved it. I loved it. I had no idea, watching him raise his glass to Claire and me, that within 2 years he would become the second half of the story I'm telling you now, or that the woman he was toasting had a history with him longer and more complicated than the one he was describing. I want to say I felt something that night, some flicker of premonition, but I didn't. I felt exactly the way a happy man feels, unguarded, grateful, entirely unprepared for what the next 3 years were going to cost me. Our first 2 years of marriage were, by any reasonable measure, good ones. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house on the east side of Tulsa, close enough to my school that I could bike some mornings. Claire built her physical therapy practice from a small clinic into a partnership with 2 other therapists. We had Sophie 14 months in, and for a while our house filled up with the specific chaos of new parenthood, sleepless nights, half-finished conversations, a baby monitor that became the third voice in every room. Ryan was around constantly, the way he always had been. He'd become something like family by then. He came to Sophie's baptism, kept a key to our house for the times we needed emergency backup with the dog, showed up unannounced with takeout on nights he knew I'd had a rough week at school. I never thought to question the frequency of it. He was my oldest friend. Claire liked him. It seemed, on the surface, like exactly the kind of extended family a lot of people wish they had. The first thing I noticed, though I didn't recognize it as anything at the time, was small and almost embarrassing in retrospect. Claire started laughing differently around Ryan. Not more, exactly, differently. A register I associated with our early dating years, before 2 years of marriage and a newborn had worn the edges off our own inside jokes. I noticed it the way you notice a song you can't place, a familiar shape with no immediate source. I told myself it was just Ryan's sense of humor. He'd always been funnier than me. I'd made peace with that in 4th grade. By the start of our 3rd year, small behavioral things had started accumulating in a pattern I still couldn't see because I wasn't looking for one. Claire's phone, which had always lived face up on the kitchen counter, started living face down. When I mentioned it once, lightly, she said something about a new case at work that required more discretion, patient privacy, HIPAA, words that sounded official enough that I didn't push further. I have thought about that conversation more times than I can count in the 2 years since. It took 9 words from me and 9 words back from her, and I accepted it completely. Ryan's visit started shifting to times he knew I had late faculty meetings, a schedule I'd mentioned to him myself, months earlier, without thinking anything of it. I didn't notice the pattern until much later, when I went back through months of memory looking for exactly this kind of evidence. In the moment, all I registered was that Claire seemed a little brighter on the nights I came home late, a little more present than she'd been in the exhausted early parenthood months before. I was grateful for it. I didn't ask why. I didn't know it then. This is what she was living through. On a Thursday evening in March, one of the nights Ryan came by while I was at a 2-hour department meeting I'd complained about for a week beforehand. I told myself it was harmless. He made me laugh the way I used to laugh before I became someone's wife and someone's mother and someone's business partner, all before I turned 30. I told myself I was allowed 1 hour of feeling like a person instead of a role. That's the lie I built the whole thing on, that feeling something didn't mean doing anything, and that as long as nothing happened, the feeling itself was harmless. I didn't tell James about the visits becoming more frequent, and I told myself the omission wasn't a lie, just a thing I hadn't gotten around to mentioning. I believed that for longer than I should have. That's what she told me, much later. I knew none of it yet. There was a night in May that I've replayed more than any other from that period. I came home unexpectedly early, a meeting cancelled, and found Ryan's car in our driveway. Nothing unusual about that on its own. But when I walked in, Claire and Ryan were sitting at opposite ends of the couch, a careful distance between them that struck me, for one unguarded second, as more deliberate than casual. Sophie's toys were scattered across the floor in a way that suggested they'd been playing with her, and the ordinary domestic scene absorbed my brief flicker of unease before it could turn into a question. Ryan left 10 minutes after I got home, same as always. I didn't think about the couch again for months. I have to be honest about something here, because it matters to the rest of what happened. I made my own mistake that spring, though a smaller one than what I'd eventually discover in Claire. A woman at a teachers' conference in Dallas, a colleague from another district, struck up a conversation that stretched into a long dinner and a longer text exchange over the following weeks. Nothing physical happened. But I let the attention flatter me longer than I should have, enjoyed feeling interesting to someone outside my marriage in a way I hadn't examined too closely at the time, and I never mentioned any of it to Claire. It wasn't the same as what she was doing. I want to be careful not to draw a false equivalence. But it means I wasn't walking through that year as a perfect, unblemished victim. I had my own small dishonesty running quietly underneath the larger one I didn't yet know about. By late summer, the vendor of small warning signs had grown into something even I, generously trusting as I was, occasionally noticed and dismissed. Claire started going to a new gym, one Ryan also belonged to, at hours that overlapped suspiciously with his. She began referencing conversations she'd apparently had with him that I had no memory of her mentioning as they happened, inside jokes I was suddenly supposed to already understand, small intimacies that had accumulated somewhere I hadn't been present for. I noticed. I told myself old friends do that. I told myself a lot of things that year. By September, 3 years into the marriage, I couldn't quite manage the easy dismissal anymore, though I still tried. Claire had started taking longer showers before bed, on nights she'd been out with the girls, a rotating cast of friends I could never quite pin down by name. She'd started keeping her purse on her side of the bed instead of on the dresser where it had always lived. Small relocations. A woman quietly rearranging the geography of her own privacy, one object at a time, and a husband too trusting to read the map. Sophie, at 2.5, had started calling Ryan Uncle Ree without any of us having formally introduced the title. I remember feeling a small warm pride about that the first time I heard it, proof that our little family had successfully absorbed my oldest friend into its structure. Looking back now, I understand that a child that age doesn't invent titles. She'd heard someone use it enough times to repeat it back. I just didn't ask who. The unusual behavior peaked, for me, on a night in late September when Claire came home from a vendor dinner for her clinic's rebranding, a phrase that, in hindsight, was doing a lot of quiet work, smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't recognize and couldn't place, one that wasn't hers and wasn't the specific wood smoke and clean laundry smell I'd have called mine. I noticed it standing in the doorway of our bedroom, and something tightened in my chest that I still couldn't name, a specific unease I mistook, in the moment, for tiredness. I didn't ask about the smell. I told myself I was imagining it, that fatherhood and a demanding job had worn my attention down to something unreliable. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever caught a detail your body understood before your mind was ready to, a smell, a tone of voice, a silence held one beat too long, you already know exactly what that felt like, standing in my own bedroom doorway, choosing not to trust myself. I called Ryan the next week, on impulse, just to catch up, the kind of call two old friends make without an agenda. He was warmer than usual, almost overly so, asked detailed questions about Sophie and about my work that felt, in retrospect, like a man checking the temperature of a room before he walks into it. At the time I registered only that my best friend was being a good friend. I hung up feeling closer to him, not further. I didn't know it then. This is what was happening on her end that same week, she told me, eventually, long after any of it could matter to change what happened next. I almost told him everything that week. I almost told James. I'd driven halfway home from Ryan's apartment with the confession already forming in my mouth, the actual sentences, and I got as far as pulling into our driveway before I lost the nerve. Sophie's window was lit up, you'd left her night light on, the little turtle one that throws stars on the ceiling, and I sat there looking at that light for I don't know how long, telling myself that saying it out loud would break something I still had time to fix quietly. I told myself I'd end it that weekend instead. I didn't end it that weekend. I told myself the same thing 4 more times before anyone else found out from me. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. By October, the anniversary of our engagement quietly passing without either of us mentioning it, I'd started keeping a low, wordless inventory of things that didn't sit right, the phone, the cologne, the overlapping gym hours, the couch distance from that May evening I still hadn't fully let go of. I hadn't organized any of it into a suspicion yet. I was a man collecting puzzle pieces without admitting to myself that he was assembling a puzzle. The clearest sign came from an unexpected direction, Claire's sister, Meg, at a birthday dinner for their mother in November. A little wine in, Meg made an offhand comment about you and Ryan being close again, like the old days, and then went visibly, immediately pale, the way people do when they realize they've said a sentence out loud that was only supposed to exist in their head. I asked what she meant. She backtracked fast, blamed the wine, changed the subject to Sophie's Halloween costume. I let her change it. But the phrase stayed with me, close again, like the old days, because it implied a history I hadn't known existed at all. I didn't know then how far back that history went, or what it had to do with an engagement dinner two people had skipped 3 years earlier. I stopped being a man who trusted easily somewhere in the first week of December, though the transition wasn't a single moment, it was a slow erosion that finally gave way all at once, the way a riverbank holds until it doesn't. I started, quietly, doing something I'd never imagined myself capable of. I began paying attention on purpose. I noted the dates of Claire's girls' nights and cross-referenced them, mentally at first, against nights I knew Ryan wasn't at his usual pickup basketball game. I noticed that every excuse involving her clinic's marketing overhaul routed, eventually, back to a consultant relationship I could never quite verify existed. The breakthrough, if you can call something that dismantled my entire life a breakthrough, came from Sophie's tablet. Claire had set up a shared photo album months earlier for family pictures, synced across both our phones and, apparently, an old device of Claire's I didn't know was still logged in. Looking for a picture of Sophie's second birthday one Saturday afternoon, I scrolled past a set of photos that didn't belong in a family album at all, screenshots of a text conversation, saved rather than sent, the kind of accidental backup that happens when cloud storage outlives the caution of the person using it. The messages were between Claire and Ryan. 8 months of them, going back to that March I'd later learn about in her own words. They weren't explicit, not at first. They escalated the way these things always seem to, starting with jokes and shared complaints about their days, sliding slowly into something with a different weight to it. Near the bottom of the thread, dated the week after that engagement dinner 3 years earlier, was a message from Ryan that stopped my breathing entirely. I still can't believe her parents actually didn't come. Guess they know something the rest of us pretended not to. I read that sentence maybe 15 times before I understood it wasn't about the wedding at all. It was about something older. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever found the one detail that reframes every question you've been too afraid to ask, you understand exactly what that Saturday afternoon felt like, sitting on my daughter's bedroom floor with her tablet in my shaking hands, the birthday photo I'd been looking for completely forgotten. Over the following 2 weeks, I built out the rest of the picture the way I'd build a lesson plan, methodically, sourcing everything, refusing to draw conclusions I couldn't support with evidence. I found a receipt for a hotel outside the city, dated to a weekend I remembered clearly because Claire had told me it was a solo work retreat, a chance to reset before her clinic's slow season ended. I found a separate email account, created under a name that wasn't hers, that I recognized only because Ryan had, at some point in the message thread, addressed her by it as an inside joke. Hey, Ren, a name I now understood was doing more work than I'd realized. There were false leads along the way that cost me real time and nearly derailed the whole investigation. A late charge at a jewelry store turned out to be a gift Claire had bought for her mother's birthday, nothing more. A weekend Ryan was unreachable turned out to have nothing to do with Claire at all. He'd been visiting his own estranged father in Missouri, a detail I only learned because I nearly confronted him over it and stopped myself just in time. Both leads felt, in the moment, like the thread that would unravel everything, and both dissolved into nothing. I understand now that I needed those false alarms as much as I needed the real evidence. Chasing them let me keep investigating without arriving, yet, at the conclusion some part of me had already reached and wasn't ready to say out loud. The real thread led back, eventually, to Claire's parents. I called Donna directly, something I'd never done without Claire present, and asked her, as plainly as I could manage, what had actually happened 3 years ago, the week of our engagement dinner. There was a long silence on the line before she answered. We found out, before the engagement, that Claire and Ryan had never really stopped, Donna said, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. Not stopped everything, stopped talking, mostly, back then. But there'd been something between them for years, on and off, going back to before she even met you. We didn't think it was our place to tell you. We thought, we hoped, marrying you would be the thing that finally ended it for good. We were wrong to stay quiet. I've known that for 3 years. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after she stopped talking, understanding, all at once, that I hadn't just been misled by my wife and my best friend for 8 months. I'd been misled, in a smaller and more painful way, by an entire family, from the very beginning, all of them hoping a wedding could quietly fix something none of them had the courage to name out loud. I confronted Claire on a Sunday evening after Sophie was asleep, the tablet's photo album and printouts of the message thread laid out on our kitchen table, the same table where I'd once eaten Ryan's takeout on nights I thought he was just being a good friend. I didn't plan a speech. I'd tried, in my head, a dozen times over the preceding week, and every version collapsed under its own weight before I could finish it. Instead I just said her name, and when she came into the kitchen and saw what was on the table, something in her face went very still, the specific stillness of someone who has been waiting for this exact moment for longer than she'd admit. "How long?" I managed. My voice came out steadier than I expected, for about 4 words. "Since March," she said. "It's Ryan." Yes. It happened. That was all she gave me, at first, 3 flat sentences, delivered without tears, without an apology, without any visible effort to soften what she was confirming. She didn't reach for me. She didn't look away either. She just stood on the other side of our kitchen table with her hands loosely at her sides, and something about the completeness of her calm undid me faster than rage would have. I felt it start in my chest, a pressure I didn't have a name for, spreading up through my throat before I could stop it. My hands were sweating. My voice went on the second sentence and simply didn't come back. I opened my mouth to ask a follow-up question and nothing came out but air and the beginning of something closer to a sob than I'd allowed myself since I was a child. I sat down at the table, hard, gripping my own knees the way you grip something to keep from falling further than you already have. I didn't try to stop what happened next. It wasn't weakness. It was 3 years being pulled out of my chest all at once, in a kitchen where I'd once believed nothing bad could happen to us. Claire didn't move toward me. She didn't move away either. She stood exactly where she'd been standing, watching me come apart with an expression I could only describe, then and now, as grief without motion, the grief of someone who had already done all her breaking down in private, months earlier, and had nothing left over to perform for an audience. "Tell me everything," I finally managed, when I could speak again. "I need to hear all of it. Not the version that makes it smaller." She finally spoke. This is what she told me. "It started at your parents' anniversary party in February, of all places. Ryan and I ended up on the back porch for maybe 20 minutes, talking about nothing, his job, my clinic, the kind of conversation we'd had 100 times before. Except that night it felt different, and I told myself it was just nostalgia, just 2 old friends remembering who they used to be before life got complicated. That's the lie I told myself the whole way through, that it was nostalgia, not something new. The first time we crossed a line was 3 weeks later, in his car outside my clinic. I told myself it was a mistake I wouldn't repeat. I believed that for about 10 days. After that, I kept choosing it, every time, and I built a new justification each time the old one stopped holding. I told myself I deserved to feel something uncomplicated, after years of feeling like I was performing a life my parents had quietly hoped would be different from the one I chose. I was terrified constantly, terrified you'd notice, terrified of losing Sophie's family the way it was supposed to look, terrified, most of all, of who I was becoming and how easily I kept becoming her. There were nights I couldn't look at Sophie's drawings on the fridge without feeling sick. I almost told you in October. I sat in the driveway with the words already in my mouth and I couldn't make myself say them. I don't have a version of this that makes it smaller. I just have the truth, finally, which is that I chose this, over and over, for 8 months, and I let you build a life around a version of me that stopped being fully true in February. She said all of it without her voice breaking once. When she finished, she folded her hands in front of her, the same stillness as before, and waited. I don't remember standing up. I remember the specific sound of my own chair scraping the kitchen floor, and then I was somewhere between sitting and standing, one hand braced on the table, my breathing ragged in a way that embarrassed me even in the moment. I let myself cry the way I hadn't in front of another adult since I was maybe 19 years old, not gracefully, not quietly, the full unmanaged shape of it. Claire watched. She didn't come closer. I understood, even through everything else I was feeling, that her stillness wasn't cruelty. It was the particular emptiness of someone who had used up all her guilt in private months earlier, and had nothing left in reserve for the moment it finally mattered. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever fallen apart in front of someone who couldn't fall apart with you, not because they didn't feel it, but because they'd already grieved it alone, on their own schedule, without you, you understand exactly how lonely that kitchen felt, even with both of us standing in it. I called my brother that night, the way I imagine a lot of men do at the exact moment their life stops making sense, and I didn't tell him everything, just that I needed him to come get me, that I couldn't be in the house. He came within the hour. Claire didn't try to stop me from leaving. She stood in the doorway as I walked out, still composed, still upright, and said only, "I'm sorry, James," in a voice that finally, for the first time that night, sounded like it might actually mean it. I filed for divorce 6 weeks later. I tried, in the space between the confrontation and that filing, to see if forgiveness was something I actually had access to. I owe it to both of us to say I tried honestly, not performatively. We went to 2 sessions of couples counseling. I listened to Claire's therapist recommended language about growth and repair, and I wanted, badly, for some part of it to take root in me. It didn't. Every time I looked at her across our kitchen table, I saw the stillness from that night instead of the woman I'd married, and I understood, eventually, that the failure to forgive wasn't a moral shortcoming on my part. It was simply the truth of what I had left to work with. Claire's parents told me the rest of what they'd known, once the divorce was already underway, not out of guilt alone, I think, but because they seemed to understand, finally, that their silence 3 years earlier had never actually protected anyone. Donna and Gary had known about Claire and Ryan's on and off history going back to college, long before I ever entered the picture. They'd hoped, quietly and wrongly, that our engagement would be the ending that finally closed that door for good. Skipping the engagement dinner had been their small, cowardly form of protest, a refusal to celebrate something they didn't believe in, without the courage to explain why. 3 years of silence, on their part and Claire's, had all been protecting the same fragile hope, that if no one said the true thing out loud, it might eventually become true anyway. It didn't. The consequences that followed weren't loud, but they were real. Claire lost the life she'd spent 3 years building around a story that could no longer hold, the marriage, obviously, but also something less tangible, the version of herself she'd been able to believe in as long as no one else could see the whole picture. In the divorce, I was awarded primary custody of Sophie and the house, along with the bulk of our shared savings, a court's plain acknowledgement of where the fault actually lay, though I never asked for it to feel like a victory, and it never did. Claire's clinic partnership dissolved within the year, less because of the affair directly and more because Tulsa's professional circles are smaller than anyone likes to admit, and reputations travel faster than any of us can outrun them. Ryan lost more than I expected him to, though I can't claim I felt much satisfaction watching it happen. His own long-term relationship, with a woman named Priya who I genuinely liked, ended within weeks of the truth becoming known. She didn't hesitate the way I had. He lost his standing with most of our shared friend group, several of whom had known him 20 years and simply stopped returning his calls once they understood the full shape of what he'd done to both of us. Last I heard, he'd moved to Oklahoma City, starting over somewhere his own history couldn't follow him quite as easily. I got Sophie every night, in the end, which is its own kind of grief and its own kind of grace all at once. I put her turtle nightlight up in the new house exactly where it had been in the old one, and some nights I sit outside her door for a few minutes before I go to bed, listening to the small sounds of her sleeping, understanding in a way I couldn't have 3 years ago how much of adulthood is just learning to protect the things that matter without waiting for someone else to tell you they're worth protecting. I understood, somewhere in the space between the confrontation and the day the divorce was finalized, that my trust hadn't been a virtue this whole time, not the unconditional, unquestioning kind I'd always been proud of. It had been an absence of a different, harder skill, the ability to notice something wrong and stay with the discomfort of noticing it, instead of smoothing it over with the first generous explanation available. I'd spent my whole life mistaking that smoothing over for kindness. It wasn't kindness. It was a kind of self-protection dressed up as trust, and I paid for the difference in full before I finally understood it. Sophie is 3 now. Last week, unprompted, she asked me where Uncle Ree went. I told her he moved away, which was true enough for a 3-year-old to hold on to. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her blocks, and I stood in the kitchen for a minute longer than the moment required, grateful that some losses are still small enough, for her, to fit inside a sentence that simple. I've had almost 2 years now to figure out which moment actually broke everything, and I keep landing somewhere I didn't expect. It wasn't the tablet, and it wasn't the hotel receipt. It was Donna's voice on the phone, thin and finally honest, telling me they'd known for years and hoped a wedding could fix what none of them had the nerve to say out loud. That sentence didn't just explain an affair. It explained an entire family's quiet agreement to build my marriage on a foundation they already suspected wouldn't hold. What stays with me now isn't even Claire's betrayal specifically, though it cost me more than I can fully measure. It's the realization that an entire circle of people around me, her parents, eventually her sister, possibly even friends who'd noticed things I hadn't, had all made individual, private decisions to stay quiet, each one telling themselves their silence was small enough not to matter. None of them lied to me directly. They simply let me walk towards something they already half understood, and called that restraint instead of what it actually was. I don't think any of them meant me real harm. I think they were protecting Claire, or protecting themselves from an uncomfortable conversation, or simply hoping, the way people do, that a problem left alone long enough might solve itself. It didn't. It rarely does. The alternative path haunts me sometimes. What would have happened if Donna had just told me, plainly, 3 years earlier, standing outside that steakhouse before the engagement dinner even started? I don't know if I'd have believed her. I don't know if I'd have listened. But I think about the version of myself who might have asked one more question, back when the cost of asking was still small, and I wonder what that man would have done with an honest answer. Have you ever found out that the people closest to you have been quietly protecting you from a truth you deserved to hear at the time, not years later? I think most of us have some version of that story, even a small one. The kindness of silence is rarely as kind as the people offering it believe it to be. If any part of this reminded you of your own moment, a silence someone kept that you wish they hadn't, or a red flag you noticed and let someone talk you out of, I'd like to hear it. Drop one word in the comments, the person, or the moment, that taught you what a family's silence can actually cost. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through. Some stories take longer to understand than others, and this was one I'm still, honestly, working out the edges of.